What if the biggest mystery in ancient Mesopotamia isn't what the clay tablets tell us, but what they never wrote down? For 4,000 years, Sumerian writers wrote everything down. Kings who started ruling and kings who lost power, floods that rose and fell, wars fought under a red moon, even how Venus moved across the night sky. But in the sacred ruins of Nippur, where Enlil's courtyard once shook with songs and smoke from offerings rose to the sky, there is silence. No tablet explains. The broken mud bricks remember ceremonies. The earth still has the ashes from sacrifices. But nowhere in thousands of clay pieces is there a single line that says the Anunnaki left. They don't leave with celebration. They don't disappear with a warning. They simply stop showing up. Their absence isn't a moment in Sumerian history. It is an empty space, huge, done on purpose, and still waiting to be understood. So before you go too deep into this mystery, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really enjoy the kind of stories that move between forgotten temples and fading memories. And if you're still with me, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'd like to imagine this question echoing across time zones the same way the Anunnaki's names once echoed across ancient cities. The story begins not with an ending but with something missing. In the 1800s and 1900s, scientists working across southern Iraq at Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and Kish dug up something amazing. Tablets upon tablets stacked like the frozen thoughts of an entire civilization. They were written in cuneiform, the world's first writing system, and they were already advanced when they appeared in history. No simple scratches, no uncertain symbols. The Sumerians wrote about their world with exactness. King lists, city inventories, songs to the gods, star observations, law codes, and woven through hundreds of these texts was a name that would interest scholars for centuries. Anunnaki, the great gods, the council of heaven, the decreers of fate. But here's what should bother you. As you look through tablet after tablet in museum collections, under cold light, behind protective glass, you'll find the Anunnaki everywhere in early Mesopotamian thinking. They judge, they bless, they assign destinies to kings and cities, and then slowly across centuries of records, they appear less and less. They show up less in royal songs. Their names fade from ceremony texts. The temples fall silent. Yet nowhere, not in a single Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, or Assyrian writing, does any writer record. Today, the Anunnaki went up to the stars and left the earth behind. There is no goodbye, no cosmic leaving scene, no final announcement. Scholars have long struggled with this silence. History prefers clear endings, especially for beings that once controlled an entire culture's understanding of space. But the Anunnaki complicate that expectation. They don't vanish in a disaster. They don't board sky chariots in the night sky. Instead, they seem to dissolve like a name whispered across too many generations, slowly losing its shape until no one remembers why they once spoke it with wonder. Modern internet stories have filled this empty space with guesses. YouTube videos claim they were aliens who returned to Nibiru. Fringe thinkers suggest they ran from a coming disaster. Ancient astronaut supporters imagine spaceports hidden beneath ziggurats. But the clay itself tells a different story, one more subtle, more human, and perhaps more unsettling than tales of space escape. Imagine holding one of these tablets in your hands. It's smaller than you'd expect, fitting in your palm, its surface covered in wedge-shaped marks that still carry the pressure of a reed pen from 4,000 years ago. This is not a symbol preserved in clay. This is paperwork, ceremony schedules, divine family trees. Enki and the World Order lists the Anunnaki as a council given specific space roles. Inanna's descent to the underworld places 7 Anunnaki as judges in the realm of the dead. Early Sumerian songs describe them as the 50 great gods, children of the Sky Father, a divine assembly that shaped destinies and kept cosmic order. They were not described as travelers from beyond the stars. They were not shown in metal suits or flying machines. They were the gods of rank, power, and sacred law, woven so deeply into the Sumerian worldview that to live in a Sumerian city was to live under the Anunnaki's watch. Every ziggurat was a meeting place between their realm and ours. Every king ruled by their command. Every offering fed their presence in the world. And then something happened. Not a single terrible moment, but a slow change that happened over 2,000 years. When Sargon of Akkad unified the Sumerian city-states around 2300 BC, the Anunnaki began to shift. Akkadian writers still wrote their names, but now as part of a larger divine order, and became Anu. Inanna became Ishtar, and the Anunnaki, while still respected, were no longer the highest power. By the time Babylon rose and Marduk was raised to king of the gods in the Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki had become Marduk's divine council. Powerful, yes, but secondary, called upon, not supreme. By the Neo-Assyrian period, the term Anunnaki barely appears in royal writings. By the late Babylonian time, the old names are ghosts mentioned in scholarly lists and priest traditions, but no longer alive in popular worship. The temples that once rang with their songs stood empty. The ceremonies that kept their presence stopped. And as new religions swept through the ancient Near East, Zoroastrianism reframing old gods as demons, Judaism absorbing divine council imagery while condemning false idols, Christianity declaring Babylon's gods defeated, the Anunnaki were not destroyed. They were forgotten. How does a god disappear? Not by flying away, but by having no one left to speak its name. Not by leaving the world, but by the world leaving the conditions that made the god real within human thinking. Some researchers point to the gradual shifts in political religion. Others note the rise of belief in one god and its need to erase competing divine structures. A few scholars even trace faint echoes of Anunnaki worship lasting into the medieval period. Moon cults in Haran, ceremony laments for Tammuz continuing in isolated communities. But the truth remains. At some point the last priest left the last temple and no one noticed the world had changed. In the Louvre, there's a boundary stone from the Kassite period covered in divine symbols, stars, crescent moons, stylized animals representing gods. Among them, a row of 7 small figures, the 7 judges of the underworld, once called the Anunnaki. They're almost too small to notice now, crowded by larger, more important deities. It's a quiet visual confession of their lowering in rank, from cosmic rulers to background figures in someone else's pantheon. Sometimes when you study these objects closely, you can still see the marks where a pen slipped, where a writer corrected a sign, where clay cracked before it dried. These are not the products of alien visitors or vanished supermen. These are the records of human beings trying to make sense of forces larger than themselves, forces they named, honored, and eventually outgrew. The silence in the texts is not the silence of beings who flew away. It's the silence of a civilization that stopped needing those particular gods to explain the cosmos. At night, in museum storage rooms across the world, thousands of these tablets rest in darkness, fragments of songs, business records, king lists, and prayers to gods whose names are now only read by scholars. And if you listen closely to that silence, you realize it's not empty. It's full of change, full of the slow, certain process by which human thinking reshapes the sacred. We think we are searching for where the Anunnaki went, but perhaps we're really asking, how do gods leave when they were never separate from us in the first place? If Sumerian tablets don't record the Anunnaki leaving Earth, then what do they actually say about who the Anunnaki were? And what does that reveal about how gods disappear? To understand what happened to the Anunnaki, you first have to step into the world that created them, not as legend but as proven reality. Picture yourself in a scribe's chamber in ancient Nippur, sometime around 2400 BC. The room is small, clay-walled with narrow windows that let in slanted afternoon light. On a low table before you sit fresh tablets, still damp, waiting for the reed pen that rests beside them. In clay jars along the wall are the records you're meant to copy and preserve. God lists, offering schedules, songs for temple ceremonies. This is not mystical work. This is paperwork. The gods must be named in proper order. Their shares of sacrificed sheep must be calculated. Their family trees must be kept accurate so that priests know which god to speak to for which request. You reach for one of the older tablets, its surface already hardened by decades in storage. Your finger traces the wedge-shaped marks, and there, pressed into the clay with the same careful exactness as a tax record, you find them. Anunnaki, the great gods, 50 in number, children of the Sky Father, not visitors, not travelers from distant planets, divine rulers native to the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. This is where the modern confusion begins and where the ancient clarity still waits to be recovered. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are never described as beings who came from elsewhere. They simply are, the way mountains are, the way the Tigris and Euphrates are. They belong to the divine order that comes before human memory. The debate between winter and summer, one of the oldest surviving story compositions, mentions them as the witnesses and judges of cosmic disputes. The instructions of Shuruppak, possibly the most ancient wisdom text we have, references them as the authorities who determine the fates of cities. They are woven into the very language of power, justice, and sacred order. But it's in the myth Enki and the world order that their nature becomes most clear. In this text, the god Enki travels through the world giving jobs to various gods, putting each god in charge of specific natural forces, crafts, or regions. The Anunnaki appear as the grand council that must approve these arrangements. They are not workers or engineers. They are lawmakers of cosmic law. When Enki announces that the goddess Nanshi will oversee fish and waterfowl or that Nasaba will govern writing and scribal arts, he does so with the Anunnaki's permission because they are the assembly that gives divine commands their binding force. Think of them less like astronauts and more like a supreme court, a heavenly senate whose decisions ripple down through the ladder of gods and into the human world. Their power flows from their parentage. They are called the children of the distant sky god whose name literally means heaven. In Sumerian thinking about space, and dwells in the highest realm of the universe far above the earth. Below him are the great gods like Enlil, lord of wind and earth, Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, and Inanna, goddess of love, war, and the morning star. And surrounding these major powers are the Anunnaki, the broader council of high gods who in assembly command what shall be. Early songs make this structure clear. A praise song to the city of Nippur where Enlil's great temple stood describes the Anunnaki gathering there to determine destinies. Another song addresses them as the great princes who stand by the divine plans and guard the commands of heaven and earth. These are not alien visitors studying human civilization. These are the civilization's own gods, the sacred authorities that make kingship right, make temples holy, and keep the cosmic order that allows crops to grow and rivers to flood at the right time. Here's what they are not described as: wearing strange clothes, piloting craft, working with metals for advanced technology, or coming down from the stars in the way modern UFO stories imagine. When Sumerian texts describe divine beings coming to Earth, they use the language of theophany. Gods appearing in visions, entering cult statues during ceremonies, or coming down through sacred gateways like the tops of ziggurats. The heavens they live in are not outer space. They are the divine dimension that runs parallel to the earthly one, reachable through sacred buildings and ceremony action. This matters more than it might seem. When we force modern space thinking onto ancient texts, reading descended from heaven as arrived from another planet, we lose what the texts actually reveal. The Sumerians didn't think of the sky as empty space filled with distant suns. They understood it as layered realms. The visible sky where birds fly, the higher realm where storms form, and beyond that the divine sphere where the gods live. To say the Anunnaki were of heaven meant they belonged to that sacred order, the unchanging realm of divine law that gives structure to the chaos of earthly life. Their connection to human cities was close, real, and completely dependent on ceremony maintenance. Each Sumerian city-state had its patron god. Enlil in Nippur, Inanna in Uruk, Enki in Eridu, Nanna in Uar. But behind these major gods stood the broader council of the Anunnaki, called upon during kingship ceremonies, consulted during major decisions, and honored in festivals that marked the rhythms of the farming year. The ziggurat in each city was called an Eker, a mountain house, an artificial sacred mountain where heaven and earth met. At the top stood a small shrine where the god could come down to receive offerings and meet with priests. Imagine standing at the base of the ziggurat, its mud brick layers rising in 3 massive platforms toward the sky. Pilgrims climb the long stairway carrying bread, beer, and incense. At the top, priests perform the daily ceremony of feeding the god, setting out meals before the cult statue, changing its clothes, burning sweet-smelling wood. This is not superstition. This is technology of a different kind, the technology of presence, the carefully kept system that keeps the divine order connected with human affairs. As long as the ceremonies continue, the gods remain. As long as the gods remain, the world holds together. The Anunnaki's role in this system was foundational, but usually invisible. They were not the gods you prayed to for a good harvest or victory in battle. They were the cosmic framework that made those prayers meaningful. They were the assembly that gave power to the patron gods. They were the witnesses when kings claimed divine right. In legal terms, they were the ultimate appeals court, the authority beyond all other authorities. But if you read carefully through the body of early Sumerian literature, you begin to notice something. The Anunnaki are everywhere and nowhere. They're called upon constantly, but rarely made individual. We know the names and stories of Enlil, Inanna, Enki, and dozens of other gods in bright detail. But the Anunnaki, despite their supreme power, remain strangely collective, a council, an assembly, a group that works as a single force. It's as if they represent something more abstract than personality, the principle of divine order itself, the structure that holds the pantheon together. And that abstraction would become important later, because when empires rose and political power shifted, when new kings needed to reshape divine ladders to match their earthly ambitions, the Anunnaki's very abstraction made them weak. Gods with names, stories, and temples could fight back, so to speak. Their priests could resist. Their cities could protest. But a council, a collective authority with no single face, that could be quietly reorganized, lowered in rank, reassigned. Which brings us to the question that haunts this story. If the Anunnaki begin as the supreme council of heaven, unchanging witnesses to cosmic order, how do they start to change? Where, in the long record of Mesopotamian history, do we first see them moving away from their original roles? And what forces were powerful enough to shift beings described as the foundation of divine law itself? Meanwhile, while writers in Nippur were still carefully pressing the names of the Anunnaki into wet clay, something was shifting on the ground, something that would eventually shift the heavens themselves. Around 2334 BC, armies began moving through southern Mesopotamia under the command of a man named Sargon. He was not Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language completely different from the Sumerian tongue. He came from the north, from a city called Akkad whose exact location we still haven't found. And within a single generation, he did what no Sumerian king had managed. He united the independent city-states of Sumer under one central rule, creating what many historians consider the world's first true empire. This was not just a political revolution. It was a religious one. When Sargon's writers began keeping records, they wrote in Akkadian using the same cuneiform writing the Sumerians had invented. They copied Sumerian business systems, Sumerian legal traditions, and, crucially, Sumerian gods. But they didn't simply copy them. They translated them, adapted them, reshaped them to fit a new imperial identity. The sky god and became Anu. The goddess Inanna, fierce patron of Uruk, became Ishtar. Enki, the clever water god, was now called Ea. The names changed, but something more subtle changed too. The relationships between these gods began to shift to reflect the new political order, and the Anunnaki remained, but their role began to blur. In Akkadian royal writings, kings still call upon the Anunnaki when claiming divine authority. But now they appeared less as the Supreme Council and more as part of a larger, less defined category of great gods. The sharp constitutional structure, the divine assembly that commanded fates, started to soften into something more flexible, more easily reorganized. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across the next 1,000 years. When earthly power came together, heavenly power came together too. And the old council structures designed for a world of independent city-states, each with its own patron god, began to feel outdated. The Akkadian Empire itself didn't last long, barely 2 centuries before it fell apart under outside invasions and internal strain. Sumerian cities briefly took back independence during what historians call the Third Dynasty period. And for a while, the old order seemed restored. Temples were rebuilt. Songs to the traditional gods flourished. The Anunnaki appeared again in their familiar form, witnesses to royal coronations and judges of divine law. But the example had been set. Empires were now possible. and the next one would reshape the divine world more dramatically than Sargon ever did. In 1792 BC, a king named Hammurabi went up to the throne of Babylon, at the time just one among many competing Mesopotamian powers. Through military conquest, diplomatic maneuvering, and 43 years of relentless expansion, he transformed Babylon from a minor city into the dominant force in southern Mesopotamia. And as Babylon rose, so did its patron god, Marduk. Before Hammurabi, Marduk was a respectable but second-tier god. He was the son of Ea, connected with water, plants, and justice. Important but hardly the supreme cosmic authority. After Hammurabi, Marduk would be reimagined as the king of all gods, the hero who saved creation itself, the god whose will superseded every other divine power. This wasn't accomplished through conquest alone. It required a religious masterpiece. The Enuma Elish, when on high, is often called the Babylonian creation story, but that description misses its true function. It's a political document, a justification for Marduk's supremacy written in the language of myth. The story goes like this. In the beginning, the ancient gods exist in chaotic waters. The younger gods, including Ea, grow restless and loud, disturbing the older generation. Cosmic war breaks out. The ancient goddess Tiamat, embodiment of the salt sea, creates monsters to destroy the younger gods. The divine council panics. None of the traditional high gods, not Anu, not Enlil, can defeat her. Then Marduk steps forward. He's young, powerful, brilliant. He offers to fight Tiamat on one condition. If he wins, he becomes the supreme ruler of the gods. The assembly agrees. Marduk kills Tiamat, splits her body in half to create heaven and earth, organizes the cosmos, and establishes the order of the universe. The other gods build Babylon as his sacred city and his temple Esagila as the center of the world. And then, in the critical moment for our story, Marduk reorganizes the divine ladder. The Enuma Elish describes the moment clearly. After Marduk's victory, the Anunnaki, all of them, bow before him. They announce him king. They surrender their authority to his judgment. Anu, the old sky father, formally transfers his power to Marduk, saying, "From this day forward, your command shall be supreme." And the 50 great gods who once formed the Supreme Council are given new roles. They will build Marduk's temple. They will serve in his court. They will enforce his commands. Read carefully and you'll see what's happened. The Anunnaki haven't been eliminated. That would be too extreme, too disruptive to centuries of religious tradition. Instead, they've been made lower. Where they once were the divine assembly, they're now part of a divine assembly that Marduk controls. Where they once commanded fates together, they now receive their fates from Marduk individually. The constitutional order has been replaced by monarchy. This religious restructuring mirrored what Hammurabi was doing politically, bringing many independent powers under one supreme authority. Just as dozens of city-states now answered to Babylon, dozens of gods now answered to Marduk, and the Anunnaki, once the framework of divine governance, became the office workers serving a divine emperor. The shift shows up in how they're mentioned in later texts. In old Babylonian prayers, you find phrases like Marduk assembled the Anunnaki or he commanded the Anunnaki to attend him. They're still powerful, still called great gods, but the grammar has changed. They're now objects of verbs, not subjects. They're acted upon rather than acting. In songs to Marduk from the Kassite period centuries later, the Anunnaki appear as his attendants, the divine witnesses who confirm his judgments rather than the judges themselves. It's a subtle lowering in rank, easy to miss if you're not reading closely. The names are still there. The respect is still there, but the function has fundamentally shifted. Imagine a supreme court that still exists but no longer has the power to rule independently. It can only approve decisions made by a higher authority. The institution survives, but its essence has been hollowed out. And this pattern continued as Mesopotamian history unfolded. When the Assyrians built their empire to the north, they raised their own patron god, Ashur, to supreme status using the same religious logic. Ashur absorbed many of Marduk's characteristics, and the Anunnaki became part of Ashur's divine court instead. The Babylonians would later reassert Marduk's supremacy, and the Anunnaki would shift loyalty again. They had become, in effect, a floating category, powerful but adaptable, prestigious but no longer structurally necessary. By the Neo-Assyrian period around 800 BC, you can track the decline in how often the term Anunnaki appears in royal writings. Kings still sometimes call upon all the great gods or the gods of heaven and earth, but the specific council of the Anunnaki is mentioned less and less. They're being made general, absorbed into broader categories, losing the distinct identity they held in early Sumerian thought. What we're witnessing isn't dramatic persecution or sudden abandonment. It's something more sneaky: institutional irrelevance. The Anunnaki were designed for a world of balanced powers, a world where no single god dominated and the council kept cosmic order through shared authority. But as political religion moved toward empire and monarchy, that model became outdated. The heavens were reorganized to match the earth. And in that reorganization, the Anunnaki went from being the supreme council to being honored guests in someone else's court. But here's where the story takes another turn, one that's both stranger and more revealing. Because if the Anunnaki were being lowered in rank and reorganized in the heavens, losing their place in the upper divine ladder, where did they go next in the imagination of the people who still remembered their names? Did they rise higher into some even more beyond realm? Or did they sink into the depths, into the realm where all old powers eventually go down? But then something strange begins appearing in the texts, something that suggests the Anunnaki's lowering in rank didn't stop at becoming Marduk's attendants. In myths written during and after the Old Babylonian period, the Anunnaki start showing up in unexpected places, not in temples, not in the assembly of heaven where fates are commanded. Instead, they appear in the Kur, the Sumerian underworld, the dark realm beneath the earth where the dead live in shadow, and they're not visiting. They seem to belong there now, installed as permanent authorities over the land of no return. The most vivid picture of this change appears in one of Mesopotamia's oldest and most haunting myths, the descent of Inanna. Imagine the story unfolding like a dream you can't quite wake from. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, queen of heaven, decides to go down into the underworld to attend a funeral, or perhaps to expand her domain, or to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who rules the dark realm below. The myth never explains her true reason, and that mystery makes it more unsettling. She simply goes, dressed in her 7 divine garments, wearing her crown, carrying her royal rod and measuring line, all the symbols of her cosmic authority. The underworld has 7 gates. At each gate, a gatekeeper stops her and demands she remove one piece of her divine power. At the first gate, her crown. At the second, her earrings. At the third, her necklace. One by one, the layers of her identity are stripped away until she reaches the final gate, naked and powerless, no longer queen of heaven, but just a being passing into the realm of death. And there, in the center of the underworld, she faces judgment, not from her sister alone, but from 7 divine judges who sit in solemn assembly. The text names them clearly, the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld. They fix their eyes upon her, the eyes of death. They speak their judgment against her. And Inanna, who once commanded the fates of mortals, is struck down, killed, and hung from a hook on the wall like a piece of meat left to rot. This is not the Anunnaki of early Sumerian songs, the grand council that stood beside Enlil in Nippur that commanded the destinies of kings and cities. These are judges of the dead, gatekeepers of the final realm, authorities whose power works in darkness rather than light. Their location has changed, and with it their entire symbolic meaning. The shift appears across multiple texts from the 2nd millennium BC onward. In older Sumerian literature, when the Anunnaki are mentioned in connection with the underworld, it's usually off to the side, a note that some of them oversee justice for the dead or that they keep cosmic order even in the realm below. But as time passes, that connection becomes central. The Anunnaki don't just occasionally appear in the underworld. They become mainly connected with it. In Akkadian spells and prayers from the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC, you find phrases like, the Anunnaki of the underworld, or, the Anunnaki who live in darkness. When writers list divine judges, they place the Anunnaki specifically in the Kala, the Mesopotamian land of the dead. In funeral texts, The Anunnaki appear as the beings who will judge a soul's deeds and determine its fate in the afterlife. They've gone from being cosmic lawmakers to being basically the supreme court of death. This is a pattern historians of religion recognize across many cultures. When a new divine order rises, the old gods don't simply vanish. They go down. They're pushed down into lower realms, into the earth, into the waters, into the spaces that the new ruling gods don't claim. The Greek Titans, overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians, were locked in Tartarus beneath the world. The Irish Tuatha De Danann, replaced by newer powers, retreated into the hollow hills and became connected with the dead. The old gods of pre-Christian Europe became demons in Christian thinking, cast down into hell. In Mesopotamia, the mechanism was more subtle, but the pattern holds. As Marduk rose, as later empires raised their own patron gods, the Anunnaki sank, not violently, not clearly, but layer by layer, text by text. Their main domain shifted from the bright realm of heaven to the dark realm beneath. The gods who once gave jobs to other gods were now given the job of ruling over endings. There's a strange dignity in this lowering in rank, though, if you look at it from a certain angle. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought was not hell. It wasn't a place of eternal punishment, at least not in the way later religions would imagine. It was simply the place where all mortals go, a vast shadowy plane where the dead exist in a lessened state, eating dust and clay, living in darkness. Someone had to govern that realm. Someone had to keep order among the infinite dead, to judge newcomers, to make sure the cosmic structure held even in the land of no return. Perhaps giving the Anunnaki this job was a way of honoring them even while moving them aside. They were too powerful, too ancient, too fundamental to simply erase. So they were given control over the one realm the new supreme gods didn't particularly want to personally oversee. The realm of endings, memory, and the exhausted past. The Anunnaki who once witnessed the beginning of cosmic order now witnessed its end in every human life. Or perhaps it was exile dressed up as honor, a way to remove them from active cosmic governance while keeping the appearance of respect. After all, the underworld judges have power, but it's reactive power. They judge what comes to them, but they don't command new fates, don't shape the upper world, don't influence the living except through fear of eventual judgment. They've been politically neutralized, given a permanent office that sounds important but wields no influence over the world that matters most to the living. The texts themselves don't tell us which interpretation is correct, and that mystery might be the point. Religious texts are written by priests and writers who serve the current political order. They're careful not to clearly dishonor old gods. That would risk angering traditionalists. And besides, true power lies in quiet reorganization, not dramatic confrontation. So the Anunnaki are given the underworld as if it were a promotion, and whether it's honor or exile depends on who's reading the text and what they're willing to see. What's undeniable is the symbolic weight of the change. The Anunnaki began as gods of sky and earth, the highest assembly, the witnesses to creation and order. They've now become mainly connected with death, darkness, and the past. They've moved from the realm of becoming to the realm of ending, from the place where new kings are crowned to the place where all kings eventually arrive, stripped of their crowns. In Inanna's descent, there's a moment after the judgment when Inanna's corpse hangs in the underworld for 3 days and 3 nights. The world above begins to die. Plants wither. Animals stop mating. Nothing grows. Only when she's rescued by clever intervention and allowed to return does life resume. The story suggests something deep. The underworld must release what it holds or the upper world cannot continue. The past must occasionally yield to the present. But the Anunnaki, unlike Inanna, are never rescued. They remain in the darkness, judging the endless line of the dead. The question the texts leave hovering in that darkness is whether they chose to stay or were forced to remain, whether their going down was change or imprisonment. And that raises another question, one that takes us beyond myth into history. If the Anunnaki sank into the underworld in the Mesopotamian imagination, what forces on Earth, what historical pressures, what political changes, what religious revolutions pushed them there? Meanwhile, beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, new religious forces were gathering that would prove far more destructive to the Anunnaki than any imperial reorganization. Around the 6th century BC, a prophet emerged in the Iranian highlands preaching a radically different vision of divine reality. His name was Zarathustra, later known as Zoroaster, and his message restructured the entire logic of how gods could exist. There was not a council of gods, not a ladder of greater and lesser powers, but a cosmic dualism. One supreme god of truth and light, Ahura Mazda, locked in eternal struggle with Angra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos and deception. Everything else, all the traditional spirits, regional gods, and divine powers that people had worshipped for thousands of years, had to choose a side or be exposed as false. And here's where the old gods began to encounter something more dangerous than lowering in rank: religious erasing. In Zoroastrian scripture, the traditional gods of the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia were recast as devas, deceptive spirits who falsely claimed divine status. They weren't honored rivals. They weren't even acknowledged as real powers worthy of underworld exile. They were lies that had tricked humanity for generations, dangerous illusions that led people away from the one true cosmic order. The entire structure that had made the Anunnaki meaningful, a world where multiple gods could coexist in complex ladders, was being declared spiritually bankrupt. This wasn't just religion, it was an ideological weapon. As Persia rose to dominate Mesopotamia under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, Zoroastrian thought began influencing how educated classes understood divinity itself. The old gods weren't being reorganized. They were being erased from the category of legitimate divine being altogether. But something even more consequential was unfolding to the West in the aftermath of another conquest. In 586 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem, burned Solomon's temple, and deported the Judean elite to Babylon in what history remembers as the Babylonian exile. For nearly half a century, Israelite priests, writers, and thinkers lived among the ziggurats and temples of Mesopotamia, surrounded by the religious architecture of the very empire that had conquered them. And in that crucible of displacement and cultural contact, something transformative happened to their understanding of God. The Hebrew texts written during and after the exile bear subtle traces of Mesopotamian influence, not in worship, but in the imagery and structures they use to describe divine reality. The opening of Genesis, where God's spirit hovers over ancient waters and creates through divine speech, echoes the space framework of Mesopotamian myths. The divine council that appears in texts like Job and Psalms, where God meets with the Elohim or sons of God to discuss human affairs, mirrors the assembly structure that once defined the Anunnaki. But here's the critical difference. Where Mesopotamian texts presented these councils as independent powers who together govern the cosmos, the Hebrew Bible puts them completely under God's control. They're not co-rulers. They're servants, messengers, or at most minor workers who carry out the will of Yahweh, the one God who tolerates no rivals. The old divine council structure has been preserved in skeleton form but emptied of its original power. What were once cosmic lawmakers have become at best angels and at worst evidence of false worship. The change shows most clearly in how the texts handle foreign gods. They're never directly named and honored. That would give them too much reality. Instead, they're referred to indirectly as the gods of the nations, as Elilim, worthless things, or as Avodah Zarah, strange service. The God of Israel doesn't defeat them in cosmic battle the way Marduk defeated Tiamat. He simply declares them irrelevant. They're not powers to be overthrown. They're illusions to be seen through. In this logic, the Anunnaki don't need to be specifically mentioned to be condemned. The entire category they lived in, gods who govern regions and require ceremony maintenance, has been made religiously impossible. There is one God who requires no feeding, who lives in no temple because he fills all space, who needs no counsel because his wisdom is absolute. Everything else is idol worship, the fundamental error of mistaking created things for the Creator. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem after Persia conquered Babylon, they brought this refined monotheism with them. And as Judaism developed over the following centuries, it became increasingly clear in its rejection of the old divine structures. The prophets mocked those who worshipped gods that have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. The psalmist declared that all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. The religious space where the Anunnaki had once existed was being systematically closed. Then came Christianity, and with it an even more aggressive campaign against the old gods. Early Christian writers inherited Judaism's monotheistic framework but added something new: a missionary urgency to convert the entire world, which meant actively taking apart competing religious systems. The Apostle Paul declared that the gods of the nations are demons. The Book of Revelation transformed Babylon from a historical empire into a cosmic symbol of spiritual corruption, the great harlot drunk on the blood of saints, destined for apocalyptic destruction. Everything Babylon represented, its temples, its ceremonies, its complex divine ladders, was cast as the opposite of sacred truth. This wasn't merely religious argument. As Christianity gained imperial power in the 4th century AD, it got the legal and military force to close temples, ban ceremonies, and destroy cult images. The gods who had once received offerings were now evidence of demonic deception. The priests who had kept their cults for thousands of years were now serving forces of spiritual darkness. And the temples, those architectural meeting points between heaven and earth, were either destroyed or converted into churches, their old functions erased by dedication to the one true God. What happened to the Anunnaki in this process was death by irrelevance. They didn't need to be specifically targeted because the entire system they belonged to was being taken apart. Monotheism's fundamental logic made their existence impossible. If there is only one God, then the Anunnaki cannot be gods. If divine councils are merely word pictures for God's internal thought, then the assembly of the 50 great gods becomes at best a poetic fiction, at worst a demonic deception. The question wasn't what should we do about the Anunnaki, but rather why are we still talking about beings that never had the reality we thought they did? Islam would later complete this process. As Islamic armies swept through Mesopotamia in the 7th century AD, the final remnants of the old temple systems were systematically shut down. The Quran declared all pre-Islamic gods to be false, their worship a fundamental violation of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. Any lingering cult practices, any continuing local traditions that still honored the old names, were suppressed as shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. By the time the last temple door closed, somewhere in the early Islamic period, the Anunnaki had endured a triple erasing. First, imperial reorganization had lowered them in rank from cosmic lawmakers to divine office workers. Second, religious lowering in rank had pushed them from heaven into the underworld. And finally, monotheism had declared the entire category of their existence to be a trick. They were not defeated. They were declared to have never truly been. And yet the erasing was never quite complete, because religious memory is stubborn and sacred geography doesn't easily forget. Temples close, but the stones remain. Ceremonies end, but the cycles they marked, planting, harvest, flood, continue. Names are forbidden, but the old connections linger in folklore, in place names, in half-remembered stories that grandmothers tell children when the priests aren't listening. Which raises a question that cuts against the official narrative of monotheistic triumph. If the Anunnaki were being rejected or demonized in new scriptures, systematically erased from legitimate religious talk, were there still places, hidden corners, stubborn communities, isolated sanctuaries, where their names were quietly spoken and their presence still called upon long after the empires declared them dead? The answer is yes, but the places where they survived might surprise you. Travel north from ancient Babylon, following the Euphrates upstream through what is now Syria and into southeastern Turkey. There, in a landscape of rolling plains and harsh summers, sits the city of Haran, ancient Haranu, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the place where Abraham's family settled before their journey to Canaan. But Haran's older identity, its deeper purpose, was something the biblical authors chose not to emphasize. This was one of the most sacred cities of the moon god Sin, called Nana by the Sumerians, a god whose family line traced back to the earliest Mesopotamian divine structures. And remarkably, worship of Sin continued in Haran, not just decades or centuries after the fall of Babylon, but for more than 1,000 years, well into the medieval Islamic period. When Arab geographers and historians began recording the region in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, they found something unexpected in Haran. A community they called the Sabians, a people who still kept temples, still observed star ceremonies, still practiced forms of worship that seemed to echo distant antiquity. The historian Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, described their temples decorated with planetary symbols. Their priests dressed in distinctive robes, performing ceremonies tied to the movements of heavenly bodies. The philosopher Al-Biruni noted their detailed systems of prayer directed toward the 7 classical planets. Their sacred texts written in Syriac, their preservation of ancient star knowledge. The Sabians of Haran occupied a strange legal position in the Islamic world. The Quran granted protected status to people of the book, Jews, Christians, and a mysterious group called Sabians. Though scholars debate who the Quran originally meant by that term, the pagans of Haran seized this mystery, identified themselves as the Sabians mentioned in Scripture, and thus secured a precarious tolerance in an otherwise monotheistic empire. They were, in effect, the last officially allowed practitioners of Mesopotamian star worship, hiding in plain sight by claiming the name of a Quranic category no one could exactly define. Their ceremonies preserved fragments of something far older than they perhaps knew. The worship of Sin, the moon god, traced directly back to the Sumerian city of Ur, where the great ziggurat to Nana had stood 3,000 years earlier. The star focus, prayers aligned with planetary movements, festivals marking sky events, echoed the sacred science that Mesopotamian priests had perfected thousands of years before. And though the Sabians likely didn't use the term Anunnaki in their ceremonies, they were keeping a religious system structured around the same space assumptions. That divine powers worked through heavenly bodies, that proper ceremony kept cosmic order, that the universe was governed by sacred laws requiring human participation. But Haran wasn't the only place where the old patterns continued. Scattered across the former Mesopotamian heartland, tucked into the practices of rural communities and embedded in folk customs, other fragments survived. The ceremony laments for Tammuz, the dying god of plants, known in Sumerian as Dumuzi, continued far longer than official religious history suggests. Tammuz was a complex figure in the old pantheon. Lover of Inanna, shepherd king who died and went down to the underworld, whose annual death and return symbolized the farming cycle. His mythology was ancient even by Babylonian standards, with roots extending back to the earliest Sumerian cities. The Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BC, expressed anger at finding Israelite women weeping for Tammuz at the north gate of the Jerusalem temple. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Jerusalem was the center of Yahwistic worship. Yet here were Jewish women participating in ceremonies for a Mesopotamian god. The detail reveals something important. Popular religious practice was far more mixed than official texts admitted. People still marked the seasons with Tammuz's laments because those ceremonies connected them to the cycles of planting and harvest in ways that went beyond religious boundaries. And this continued. The 4th century church father Jerome complained about peasants in the Levant still observing Tammuz ceremonies in his time, 800 years after Ezekiel's complaint. Medieval Arabic sources mention communities in Iraq and Syria performing seasonal mourning rites in the hot month of July, which they called Tammuz in their calendar. Women would gather, sing laments, and weep for the dying god, much as their ancestors had done for 3,000 years. The content may have been Christianized or Islamized on the surface, the mourning redirected toward acceptable religious figures, but the structure, the timing, the emotional pattern remained rooted in Dumuzi's ancient cycle. These weren't organized cults with temples and priesthoods. They were memory fragments, cultural echoes, half-understood customs kept because that's what grandmothers had taught daughters generation after generation. The religion was gone, but the ceremony gesture survived. The same way we might knock on wood or throw salt over our shoulders without remembering the gods those actions once called upon. But even these faint echoes couldn't last forever. The pressure was relentless. Christian bishops condemning pagan remnants, Islamic authorities enforcing orthodox practice, the steady piling up of centuries that gradually wore away everything not actively protected. In Haran, the Sabian community faced waves of persecution whenever authorities decided their claim to people of the book status was false. Their temple was destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed again, converted into a mosque. By the 11th century, their numbers had shrunk. By the 13th century, the last clear references to their star worship disappear from the record. Somewhere, we don't know exactly when, in which year, which decade, someone performed the last ceremony to sin. A priest, or perhaps just an elderly man who remembered how his father had done it, stood before an altar and spoke prayers that stretched back through the Assyrians and Babylonians and Akkadians to the Sumerians of Ur. He didn't know he was the last. There was no ceremony marking the end. No acknowledgement that a chain of worship reaching back 3,000 years was about to break. He simply performed the ceremony, and then days or months or years later he died, and no one carried it forward. Elsewhere, perhaps in a village in Syria or Iraq, an old woman taught her granddaughter the lament for Tammuz, the mourning song for the dying god of summer. But the granddaughter, converted to stricter Islamic practice or married into a family that scorned old ways, never passed it on. The last performance happened in darkness, witnessed by no historians, preserved in no text. This is how gods die in reality. Not in cosmic battles or apocalyptic revelations, but in quiet abandonment, one forgotten ceremony at a time. The temples that once housed the Anunnaki's worship suffered the same fate. The great ziggurat of Ur, where Sinanna had received offerings for centuries, gradually crumbled as the Euphrates shifted its course and the city was abandoned. The temple of Enlil in Nippur, center of Anunnaki religion, was systematically taken apart for its bricks by later builders who needed construction material and saw only ruins, not sacred architecture. The Asagila of Babylon, Marduk's temple, stood until the Seleucid period before finally collapsing into the earth. Layer by layer, mud brick by mud brick, the physical infrastructure of the old gods returned to the dust it came from. No one gathered to mourn these closures. No ceremonies marked the end. The priests simply stopped coming. The offerings stopped arriving. The doors stopped opening, and wind began moving through empty chambers. Perhaps a few old men devoted to traditions that had lost all social support tried to keep the forms for a while, but eventually they died too, and the silence became permanent. By the time European archaeologists began digging in the 1800s, the temples had been buried so long that local villagers didn't remember what lay beneath the mounds. The Anunnaki had been forgotten so completely that their name was a mystery waiting to be rediscovered by scholars reading clay tablets in museum collections. If the ceremonies finally stopped, the priests vanished, and the temples fell silent, if no one speaks a god's name for centuries, if no one performs the actions that once made that god present in the world, what does it actually mean in human terms for a god like those of the Anunnaki to die? The answer requires us to think differently about what gods are in the first place. In modern thought, we tend to treat gods as either real supernatural beings who exist independently of human belief or as complete fictions that humans invented. But the Mesopotamians wouldn't have understood either of those categories. For them, gods were presences, patterns of power, meaning, and sacred order that showed themselves through ceremony, story, and place. A god wasn't simply real or imaginary. A god existed in the relationship between the divine realm and human practice. Think of it this way. Enlil's temple in Nippur wasn't just a building dedicated to an entity who lived somewhere else. It was the location where Enlil's presence in the world was most concentrated, most reachable. The ceremonies performed there, the daily offerings of bread and beer, the washing and clothing of the cult statue, the songs sung at specific times, weren't symbolic gestures toward an absent being. They were the actions that kept Enlil's active presence in the world. The god and the cult were not separate. They were interwoven. So when worship stops, when ceremonies cease, when stories are no longer told and names no longer spoken, the god doesn't go anywhere. The god simply stops being shown, stops being present in the world in the way it once was. It's not death in the biological sense. Gods never lived in bodies that could decay. It's something more like fading, like a radio signal that grows weaker until it's impossible to tell from static. The German theologian Rudolf Otto explored this in his study of religious experience. He coined the term numinous to describe the distinctive feeling that comes with encounters with the sacred, a combination of awe, fear, fascination, and overwhelming presence that he called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. That feeling, Otto argued, is universal. Every culture experiences it. But how cultures interpret that experience, what they name it, what ceremonies they build around it, that changes. The energy Otto described doesn't vanish when one religious system falls apart. It migrates. It gets reassigned to new forms, new names, new religious structures. The feeling that once occurred when a Sumerian priest entered Enlil's temple at dawn, that sense of standing before cosmic authority, didn't disappear from human experience. It simply got redirected. Perhaps it occurred next when a Jewish worshipper approached the temple in Jerusalem, or when a Christian monk entered the pre-dawn silence of a monastery church, or when a Muslim heard the call to prayer echoing across an ancient city at far. This helps explain something puzzling about the Anunnaki's disappearance. Their structural function never really died. It just got repurposed under new names and frameworks. Consider the Divine Council. In early Sumerian thought, the Anunnaki formed the assembly that commanded fates and kept cosmic order. When that structure was supposedly taken apart by monotheism, did the pattern actually disappear? Not entirely. It resurfaced in Judaism's Elohim, the divine beings who attend God's heavenly court in texts like Job and Psalms. It reappeared in Christian angelology, where ladders of angels, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, principalities, form a complex heavenly office system surrounding God. It emerged again in Islamic tradition with ranks of angels performing specific cosmic functions under Allah's absolute authority. The pattern continued because the pattern served a psychological need. Humans understand power through ladder, authority through councils, cosmic order through giving out responsibility. We need the universe to be organized, governed, kept by forces greater than ourselves. When the Anunnaki could no longer serve that function, when their specific names and stories became culturally unavailable, the need itself migrated to new forms. The 50 great gods became 70 nations with their assigned angels became 9 choirs of angels became the 99 names of God, each fulfilling a similar psychological role, making the infinite understandable by giving it structure. Even when gods were actively condemned, their patterns often survived in inverted form. Early Christian demonology borrowed heavily from older pantheons, not just in naming demons after old gods like Baal or Astarte, but in keeping the idea of latter spiritual powers lined up against heaven. The demons of Christian tradition often organized themselves like a dark mirror of the angelic ladder, which itself mirrored the divine councils of older systems. The Anunnaki's structural DNA continued even in religions clearly designed to replace them. From a certain angle, this isn't erasing. It's evolution. The specific forms the Anunnaki took, clay tablets listing their names, songs sung in Sumerian, offerings left in Mesopotamian temples. Those were adapted to the needs of city-states in the Bronze Age Near East. As civilizations expanded, as empires connected distant peoples, as trade routes spread ideas across continents, religious systems needed to become more abstract, more universal. A god who was specifically the patron of Nippur and spoke only Sumerian couldn't serve a multicultural empire spanning from Egypt to India. So the divine council structure became more general. The concept of cosmic ladder continued. But the specifics, the 50 Anunnaki with their individual names and city connections, became too localized, too particular. The age demanded gods who could be worshipped anywhere, whose authority wasn't bound to specific rivers and specific temples. The old forms weren't destroyed so much as outgrown, like a child who stops playing with toys, not because toys are bad, but because different activities now serve the developmental needs that play once fulfilled. This suggests something deep about the Anunnaki's departure. They didn't leave because they were defeated or exposed as false. They left because the human thinking that kept them going evolved into forms they couldn't adapt to. The world became larger, more connected, more cosmopolitan. The old gods of place and particular cities couldn't scale to meet that expansion. New religious technologies, monotheism, universal ethics, portable scriptures, proved more effective at organizing meaning across diverse populations. The Anunnaki fulfilled their role perfectly for the world they were designed for. They provided cosmic order for independent city-states, each needing divine legitimacy for their rulers and sacred structure for their social ladders. When that world ended, when cities became provinces, when empires erased borders, when trade made every place less distinct, the Anunnaki's specific form of presence became outdated. But their essence, the human need for cosmic order, for divine ladder, for sacred structure that makes the universe understandable, that didn't die. It's still active in every religious system that imagines heaven as organized, that structures spiritual authority in ranks, that sees the cosmos as governed rather than random. The Anunnaki are gone only in the way that Latin is a dead language, meaning nobody speaks it natively anymore, but its structure survives in the Romance languages, in scientific terms, in legal phrases, in the grammar that shapes how millions of people still think. What died wasn't the Anunnaki themselves, but the specific cultural, linguistic ceremony matrix that made them perceivable in that particular form. The tablets stopped being read. The language stopped being spoken. The ceremonies stopped being performed. And gradually the specific way of experiencing the sacred that the Anunnaki represented became unreachable, not because it was false, but because the cultural technology to access it was lost. This is why the question of whether the Anunnaki were real misses the point entirely. They were as real as language is real as law is real, which is to say they existed within and through human cultural practice, shaping thinking and being shaped by it. When the practice ended, that form of reality dissolved, leaving only traces. Tablets in museums, names in scholarly indexes, patterns that migrated into new forms. But if the Anunnaki never left in a physical sense, if they only changed, evolved, dissolved into structures we still use under different names, what do the tablets themselves still hold that modern readers are just beginning to understand? Return with me to where we began. The archive rooms, the museum storage facilities, the climate-controlled spaces where thousands of clay fragments rest under soft light. Each tablet is a frozen moment, a scribe's hand pressing into wet clay 4,000 years ago, recording what needed to be remembered. Some are the size of your palm, others barely larger than a postage stamp. Their surfaces are covered in wedge-shaped marks that look to the untrained eye like abstract patterns. But to those who can read them, their voices. Business records, royal songs, temple inventories, mythological narratives, each one a data point in the slow change we've been tracking. Let's read them in time order, like pages in a book that no one intended to write. The earliest texts from the mid-3rd millennium BC, the early dynastic period of Sumer, present the Anunnaki with clarity and importance. In business texts from Nippur and Lagash, they appear in offering lists, quantities of bread, beer, and sheep given to the Anunnaki. In royal writings, kings claim authority by the command of the Anunnaki. In story compositions like The Song of the Hoe, they're described as the gods who approved Enlil's creation of humanity. They're not background figures. They're structural, woven into the language of legitimate power. A tablet from Shuruppak dating to around 2600 BC lists the Anunnaki among the witnesses when major divine decisions are made. Another from Gursu records an oath sworn by En and the Anunnaki, calling upon them as the ultimate guarantors of truth. In these early texts, they're treated as obviously important, requiring no explanation. The writers assume their audience knows who the Anunnaki are and why their names carry weight. Move forward to the Akkadian period, late 3rd millennium BC, and the picture begins to shift. The Anunnaki still appear, but now often in Akkadian translations where Sumerian originals said something slightly different. They're still called upon in royal writings, still mentioned in mythological texts, but the emphasis has changed. A song to Ishtar from this period mentions her authority over all the great gods, with the Anunnaki included in that broader category. The exactness is beginning to blur. Old Babylonian texts from the early 2nd millennium BC show the change speeding up. Here we find the Anunnaki in Inanna's descent, sitting as judges in the underworld rather than commanding fates in heaven. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're mentioned briefly as the gods who commanded that Enkidu must die, a decision made by the council, but one that feels mechanical, procedural, lacking the cosmic weight of earlier texts. They're present but lessened, still structurally necessary, but no longer the center of divine authority. By the Kassite and Middle Babylonian periods, middle to late 2nd millennium BC, clear mentions of the Anunnaki become rarer. You find them in scholarly texts, in lists of divine names put together by writers preserving tradition. You find them in religious commentaries explaining older myths. But in contemporary royal writings, in prayers written for current use, the term appears less frequently. Kings call upon all the great gods or list specific major gods: Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash. But the Anunnaki as a named collective are fading from active religious vocabulary. In Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts, 1st millennium BC, the references become fragmentary. A scholar copying an ancient song includes them because that's what the original said, but contemporary compositions increasingly omit them. The gods who matter now are the patron gods of empires. Ashur for Assyria, Marduk for Babylon. The old council structure is linguistically preserved but functionally irrelevant. Now, here's what's striking about this 4,000-year archive. Nowhere in any of these texts, not in the earliest, not in the middle periods, not in the latest fragments, does any writer record anything resembling a departure announcement. There's no tablet that says, "In this year, the Anunnaki held their final council and went up to the heavens not to return." There's no royal chronicle mentioning that the gods withdrew from their temples. There's no priestly lament describing the moment when the divine presence departed. The silence is total, and that silence is itself the answer to our question. Modern minds, especially those influenced by science fiction and ancient astronaut theories, expect gods who came from elsewhere to eventually return there. We imagine departure scenes. Spacecraft going up, portals closing, divine beings waving goodbye as they retreat to higher dimensions. We read ancient texts looking for that moment of exit. And when we don't find it, we assume it must have been hidden, coded, or lost. But the tablets reveal something more ordinary and more deep. The Anunnaki didn't leave because they were never the kind of beings that could leave. They weren't travelers. They were the structure itself, the way Mesopotamian civilization organized its understanding of cosmic authority. And what the tablets document isn't their departure, but their change, the slow reorganization of that structure across centuries of political and religious change. Watch the pattern emerge when you read the tablets in order. Early, Anunnaki as supreme council for commanding fates together, representing the distributed power structure of independent city-states. Middle, Anunnaki made lower to rising imperial gods like Marduk, reflecting the bringing together of political power into empires. Late, Anunnaki sent to underworld roles or absorbed into generic categories as newer religious systems emphasized individual supreme gods over councils. Final, Anunnaki mentioned only in scholarly copies of ancient texts, their active function replaced by monotheistic frameworks that had no structural place for divine assemblies. This is what religious evolution looks like in real time, documented in clay. Not a dramatic event, but a gradual drift. Names used less frequently, roles reassigned, importance lessened until eventually the term survives only as an artifact of linguistic history. The tablets don't record the Anunnaki leaving Earth because that's not what happened. What happened was that Mesopotamian civilization evolved beyond the religious structures that made the Anunnaki meaningful. City-states became empires. Local gods became universal ones. Polytheistic systems were challenged and eventually replaced by monotheistic ones. And in that change, the Anunnaki, like countless other divine figures, were reorganized, reassigned, and finally made outdated. Here's the synthesis. The archaeology shows us temples abandoned not in disaster but in gradual neglect. The textual evidence shows us names fading from active use over centuries. The religious history shows us newer systems absorbing and redefining older structures. The psychology shows us how sacred presence moves when ceremony ceases. Every strand of evidence points to the same conclusion. The Anunnaki changed with us, not independent of us. They were never separate from the civilization that thought them up. When that civilization evolved, when new empires brought new political structures, when new religions offered new ways of understanding the sacred, the Anunnaki evolved too. From cosmic lawmakers to divine office workers to underworld judges to half-remembered names in ancient texts, each change tracked exactly with changes in human political and religious organization. The tablets reveal this if you read them not for what they confirm about modern theories, but for what they actually say, that the story of the Anunnaki is the story of how humans organize power, authority, and meaning through divine structures. When those structures no longer serve their purpose, they don't violently collapse. They gradually fade, repurposed, or abandoned as thinking finds new forms. If this is what the tablets quietly reveal, that the Anunnaki's departure was really our evolution, that their absence is really our change, Then what does that mean for us, standing now in museum archives and desert ruins, still asking about gods who vanished thousands of years ago? You're standing in the ruins again. Not the museum archives with their controlled temperature and protective glass, but the actual place where it all began. Nippur, or what remains of it in southern Iraq, where the wind carries sand across broken mud brick. It's late afternoon, moving toward dusk. The ziggurat of Enlil, once the most sacred structure in Sumer, the place where the Anunnaki gathered to command the fates of kings, is now just a massive mound of eroded earth with ancient walls barely visible beneath centuries of piled dust. The shadows are lengthening. The heat of the day is finally breaking. And as you walk through what was once the sacred courtyard, the same wind that moved across these stones when priests performed dawn ceremonies 4,000 years ago moves across them now, uncaring about the collapse of everything that once made this place the center of the world. But something has changed since you first arrived at these ruins, asking where the Anunnaki went. Now you understand. They didn't go anywhere. They changed layer by layer through mechanisms we've traced across 9 chapters of evidence. Political reorganization, religious lowering in rank, religious replacement, ceremony abandonment, cultural evolution, and finally the simple fading that occurs when no one speaks a name anymore. The Anunnaki were never visitors who could pack up and leave. They were the way an entire civilization structured its relationship with cosmic authority, with sacred order, with the forces that made rivers flood predictably and kings rule legitimately and cities prosper under divine protection. They were the answer ancient Mesopotamia gave to the fundamental human questions. Who governs the cosmos? What makes power legitimate? How do we connect the eternal with the temporary, the divine with the earthly? And when those questions needed different answers, when city-states became empires, when local gods needed to become universal, when polytheism gave way to monotheism, the Anunnaki didn't resist or flee. They simply dissolved into new forms. Their structural DNA preserved even as their specific identity faded. The divine council became the angelic ladder. The cosmic lawmakers became heavenly office workers. The witnesses of fate became the judged rather than the judges. The names changed. The story shifted. And eventually, even the memory grew faint until all that remained were clay tablets waiting in the dark for someone to remember how to read them. This is the real revelation the Sumerian tablets offer. Not a hidden history of ancient astronauts, but something more deep and more human. The pattern of how we create gods to meet our needs, crown them with supreme authority, then slowly lower them in rank when new needs arise. We reshape the sacred to match our evolving thinking. And we do it so gradually that we rarely notice the change happening. The Anunnaki left when Sumer's world ended, when the last person who could read Sumerian died, when the final temple closed, when the ceremonies that kept their presence ceased. But the sacred instinct that created them never ended. It just found new forms, new names, new structures. Every age builds its own divine architecture, its own way of organizing the mystery that Otto called the numinous. The specific form the Anunnaki took, 50 great gods in assembly, commanding fates from a ziggurat in Nippur, that form was perfectly adapted to Bronze Age Mesopotamia. When that world ended, the form ended with it. Which brings us to now, to this moment, to why we're still asking about the Anunnaki thousands of years after their names stopped being spoken in prayer. Our modern obsession with ancient aliens and lost civilizations isn't really about history. It's mythology dressed in the language of science fiction. New stories we're telling about old mysteries, new ways of making the distant past seem more dramatic, more relevant, more connected to our technological present. When we imagine the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials, we're doing exactly what the Babylonians did when they reimagined them as Marduk's servants. We're reshaping old gods to fit our current worldview. The Babylonians needed imperial ladder, so they made the Anunnaki into subordinates. We're fascinated by space travel and advanced technology, so we make them into ancient astronauts. In a strange way, this means the Anunnaki are still alive, not as the beings the Sumerians worshipped, but as symbols we continue to reshape, according to our needs. Every YouTube video claiming they were aliens, every documentary guessing about their technology, every theory about their return, these are the modern ceremonies, the contemporary way of keeping their names in circulation. We've replaced temple offerings with internet attention, songs with podcast episodes, clay tablets with digital archives. The form has changed completely, but the impulse remains. We're still trying to make sense of these ancient beings, still trying to fit them into frameworks that help us understand our place in the cosmos. Perhaps every age creates its own version of the Anunnaki, its own mysterious powers that seem to work beyond normal human understanding. The Sumerians made them divine lawmakers. The Babylonians made them imperial servants. The Zoroastrians and Christians made them demons or false gods. And we've made them aliens, visitors from beyond who possessed knowledge we're only now beginning to rediscover. Each interpretation reveals more about the interpreters than about the interpreted. Stand here in the ruins as the last light fades, and you can almost feel the weight of that pattern, the endless human cycle of reaching toward the sacred, giving it form and name and ceremony, then watching those forms slowly change or fade as thinking evolves. The Anunnaki are just one instance of something that happens over and over. Gods rise when they serve a need, and they fall when they no longer do, not because they were false, but because the human world that kept them going changed into something new. The tablets sit in museums now behind glass under conservation quality light. Scholars study them, translating the wedge-shaped marks back into words, rebuilding the myths and songs and business records that once made the Anunnaki real within Mesopotamian thinking. And in that act of reading, something peculiar happens. The Anunnaki flicker back into a kind of existence, not the existence they had when priests fed their statues and sang their praises, but a different kind, the existence of being known, remembered, studied, wondered about. Maybe that's all gods ever were, patterns of meaning that exist in the relationship between human thinking and the mysteries it faces. They're real when they're active in culture, when ceremonies keep them going and stories transmit them and communities organize around them. They fade when that cultural support dissolves, and they can return in altered forms when new communities find new reasons to remember them. The wind moves across the ruins, the same wind that's been blowing here for 5,000 years. The ziggurat is barely visible now in the gathering darkness, just a massive shadow against the slightly lighter sky. Somewhere beneath your feet are tablets still unexcavated, still waiting in the earth, still holding marks pressed there by hands that wanted to preserve something against the erasing power of time. Those tablets won't tell you where the Anunnaki went, but they'll tell you something more important. How human beings have always reached toward the infinite, given it names and forms, built structures to honor it, then watched those structures crumble as the world changed and new forms became necessary. Every age has its own Anunnaki, its own way of naming the mystery, its own structures for encountering the sacred, its own gods that seem eternal until they're not. The Sumerians had their cosmic council. We have our own frameworks now, our own ways of organizing meaning and power and the sense that something larger than us governs existence. You turn from the ruins and begin walking back as darkness settles. The question that lingers isn't, where did the Anunnaki go? That's answered. They dissolved into the change of human thinking, repurposed and renamed and eventually forgotten except as subjects of scholarly study and speculative reinterpretation. The question that lingers is softer, more unsettling, more immediate. If the Anunnaki are what happens when a civilization tries to make sense of the cosmos, when it builds divine structures to organize meaning, then watches those structures slowly become outdated, what new gods are we quietly shaping today? What names are we giving to the mystery? What ceremonies are we performing without recognizing them as sacred? And when future archaeologists dig through our ruins, what will they conclude about the powers we honored, then forgot, then changed into something they won't quite recognize? The tablets hold their silence. The wind continues, and somewhere in the dark the pattern repeats, as it always has, as perhaps it always will.